on behalf of the Calgary Adapted Hub, powered by Jumpstart, to our guests who are joining us. Welcome, and thank you for committing your time and being willing to engage in this conversation. And then last but not least, thank you, Andrea, for being the willing participant and future YouTuber, and being our guest today. If I may, a land acknowledgement. I'm actually at my home in Cochrane today. And so I actually, as I look out my office window, formerly one of my children's bedrooms, I look towards Stoney Nakoda. And so as I sit in my office, I acknowledge and recognize and respect the land that we're on. And for those of us who are our international guests today, I don't know if this is a familiar process with you, but certainly here in Canada in the last couple of years, as part of ongoing truth and reconciliation, we're trying our very best to acknowledge the land that we live and play on. And so that's my opportunity to do that to start. And Andrea, you certainly may, if you wish, speak to where you're situated, because I know you're joining us today from Vancouver. But if I may, just to present some introductory comments about Andrea, and then I'll pass the floor over to her. I've known Andrea for a number of years. She's an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia in the School of Kinesiology, based in Vancouver. She is a principal investigator in what's called the International Collaboration on Repair Discoveries, ICORD, at UBC. And her research interests explore the intersections of sport and disability, of which we're going to spend some time talking about today, and the ways in which disabled people are simultaneously both included and excluded from sport practices. Her recent projects have considered gender equity in the Paralympic movement, how sport organizations are funded and supported to integrate disability sport programming, and how Paralympic athletes engage in advocacy work on social media and online platforms. And her interests in Paralympic sport actually stems from her own lived experience as a guide in racing for paranautic skaters. And I believe you competed in the 2010 and 2014 games, so in Vancouver and Sochi. And Andrea sent actually 3 learning objectives, which you may have already seen in our promotional posters. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about what those objectives are. Or Andrea, I haven't really had a chance to debrief with you first. Did you want to do that, or do you want me to do that first?
I'm happy for you to do that. Yeah, go right ahead if you like.
Well, I don't know if I like, but I will do it. I will gladly do it. I have the tendency sometimes to actually take over presentations. And so
well, you know what, I do have them sort of included early on in the presentation. And maybe, yeah, there is a slide if that's a little more fluid.
Okay, good. And then I'll moderate once your presentation is done, and encourage the questions. So to our guests that are listening in, by all means, feel free to use the chat function, which is on the bottom left of your screen, although I'm sure you're familiar with that process so far. And I'll try to moderate that and use that to engage in the conversation once Andrea has completed her presentation. So Andrea, over to you. Thank you again, and it's great to see you.
I'm just sharing my screen here.
It's coming up, yeah, that's good.
There we go. Well, thank you so much to David for the introduction, to Letitia for organizing and all the planning that goes into this speaker series. And thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you. It is a real pleasure. I mean, from what I understand of this group, it's a group that really comes together around research and practice and personal experience and engagement with the sport system. And I mean, that's the space I love to work and play in as well. I will also thank David for providing me with the opportunity to do a land acknowledgement, or let you know where I am situated and where I conduct this work. I am, as he mentioned, in Vancouver, and specifically on the campus, the Point Grey campus of UBC, which is situated on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam people. And for those of you who've had the opportunity to be here in person, it is an incredibly breathtakingly beautiful place. And I am very grateful to the stewards of the land and the opportunity to live here. I've entitled my talk today, Taking Sides, Disability Sport Research as Advocacy Work. And, it's a bit of a research talk. It's also a bit of a personal tale of my own path into research, my path into parasport, and more importantly, how those two things come together for me and how I think of my research as contributing to the type of parasport community that I want to be a part of. I'm going to be talking about two specific projects that actually David mentioned in the introduction, one looking at integration of the sport system and funding structures for integration, and the other on gender equity in the Paralympic movement. But I want to be very, very clear that my goal of sharing that work is not actually to spend too much time talking about the specific research itself, although I'm of course happy to do that, but rather to think about, how can this research maybe spark some ideas, spark some conversation about your own work, and collectively about our place in the parasport system, our place as researchers, as practitioners, as participants, and how we can collectively advance parasport. So please keep in mind these research projects are being shared as sort of prompts for discussion. I also need to start by saying that, I'm the one speaking today, but every project I work on has a lot of collaborators. That's fundamental to the work I'm involved in. So every project you're seeing is a group effort. And I have the privilege of sharing it on behalf of our team. That is all. I will try to acknowledge as many people as I can while I go along. Maybe a bit about me. I said this was going to be a professional and a personal talk. So this is maybe the professional pathway side. I spent many years in Calgary. I did my undergraduate at the University of Calgary in kinesiology, possibly called Human Kinetics at the time, or maybe it was kinesiology then, Human Kinetics now. I can never remember which way, but I majored in biomechanics. I was an athlete in high school. All of my coaches had biomechanics degrees. I didn't know what else to do, so that's what I signed up for. And at the end of 4 years, I knew two things. I love listening to biomechanics talks, and I have no desire to do biomechanics research myself. So fortunately, I did take a year off in my studies to work for the Canada Games. I was the medical services coordinator for the 2005 Jeux du Canada Games in my hometown of Regina. And that meant I was responsible for like the polyclinic, for organizing all the medical volunteers that attend the games, for setting up doping control stations, for emergency protocols. And at the end of that year, I realized that I really like working at that intersection of athletes and health services, medical services. But my interest was also like, where are athletes positioned in these systems? Where are their rights being protected? Where are they not being protected? So it was thinking about some of those questions that I did a 180. Well, in some ways I did, some ways I didn't. I went right back to a kinesiology program. Because we are multidisciplinary, and my degree somehow qualified me to apply to grad school at UBC in kinesiology, and no one thought to check and see, well, what was her major? And I applied for sociology in the program of kinesiology. I ended up with a professor of sociology and doing sociocultural studies in kinesiology. No idea why they accepted me. I had never taken a sociology class in my life. But that's where I stayed for several years. I did my master's and my PhD at UBC. I then went on to do a postdoc at Loughborough University in the UK. I'm pronouncing that wrong. You could pronounce it 10 different ways and you'd still be wrong all times. But for those of you who don't know, Loughborough University it's a small town in the middle of the UK. But the reason you might know it is it's a big center for disability sport. It's where many of the GB Paralympic teams train, and they have a research center called the Pierre Harrison Center for Disability Sport that does some really leading research in the area of sport sciences for Paralympic sport. So I was very fortunate to spend a couple of years there. I then got a faculty position back at UBC and returned in 2016 back to the same school of kinesiology. And as David mentioned, I'm also a principal investigator at ICORD. So ICORD is an international collaboration, is International Research Institute. I'm actually in my ICORD office right now. and we study spinal cord injury. And our mission is to make spinal cord injury preventable, curable, and livable. I'm on the livable side of that, as in most of my work at I-Cord focuses on, quality of life and physical activity experiences for people with spinal cord injury. And the picture on this slide is actually of the facility that I oversee at I-Cord called Park. And it's essentially a gym. It's a community gym for people with spinal cord injuries where all the equipment is adapted. And it's staffed by our kinesiology students who support individuals with spinal cord injuries to engage in physical activity and meet their physical activity and exercise goals. So, but something happened. That was a really long, covered like a 20-year span there. Something happened in the middle of that I think really shaped the direction of my career. And that something was a woman named Courtney Knight, and also a coach. I actually can't see the screen because your faces are all covering it, but a coach over in this right-hand side picture called Jeff Whiting. Jeff Whiting is a cross-country ski coach. Some of you might know him. That wouldn't surprise me at all. We often refer to him as the father of para-Nordic skiing in Canada. He has been running events and coaching and developing both like programs and athletes since the 1980s. And in this picture, he's in northern Saskatchewan with a bunch of sit skiers about to set out on the trails. I also grew up in Saskatchewan, grew up skiing. And when Jeff found out that I was living in Vancouver, he immediately put me in touch with Courtney Knight, who is a local VI athlete who was training towards, I guess, the 2010 Paralympic Games to try to make that team. And she needed a new guide. So it was Jeff who connected us. And soon I was skiing with her every evening, every weekend, and doing my grad studies during the day. Now, when you ski with someone, you spend a lot of time in the car, especially in Vancouver. We're driving to Whistler, we're driving to Cyprus. So Courtney and I had a lot of time to talk. And one of the things we talked about was like, we had very similar sport experiences. We are about the same age. We grew up in smaller cities, I guess, not small towns, but smaller communities. And we were in sport from an early age, and we had some success from an early age. We were both on the provincial team in 2 different sports. We were both on national teams by the time we were like 14. We'd even been at the same events, like staying in the same dorms for probably the last 10 years, although we didn't know each other. And then there's this one area of difference, and that's, Courtney had faced discrimination in sport that was just completely foreign to my experience. She had the experience of being an athlete in a club that really didn't value her or her contributions, or where she was called the squeaky wheel for just asking for things that she needed. And, I knew that sport wasn't always a positive experience, but like, it was in these conversations with Courtney that really drove home that, my sport experiences in many ways were unique, that I've been incredibly privileged in my sport experiences. And actually, there were many people in Courtney's situation of loving sport, of wanting to participate in sport, who hadn't had that same positive experience that I had. I'll just tell you a bit about the other pictures. You've got in yellow, that's me guiding Courtney at the 2010 Games. We did make the team. It was incredible to race here in front of a home crowd. And then Courtney retired, and she actually now works in the hospital that I-Cord's in. So she's actually probably a building away from me right now, doing her work as a rec therapist. And when she retired, I partnered with another athlete, Margarita Gorbanova, who's in the other slide there. And Margarita and I got to race in Sochi together. So 2 women who really, shaped my experiences. Courtney is also one of the most persuasive people you're ever going to meet. And one of her ideas was like, hey, Andrea, we can't just talk about these things. We need someone to do the research here. And you're the researcher, you're in grad school, you're going to study parasport. So we devised this project that was called the Athletes First blog. And essentially it was a co-authored blog. We started in 2011, I guess, or maybe 2010. And it was every week we would have a different para athlete write a blog post, usually para athlete, sometimes a coach or a volunteer. And there was no rule except that it had to be about sport. It had to be about disability. And you had to generate some kind of conversation. You had to ask a question of the reader, or like try to engage the readers in some sort of response. And we did that for a year. And at the end of the year, we had readers in 90 countries. We had 6,000 comments. When I printed it off, I think I had about 400 pages of comments. And this was actually my PhD work. This blog became my PhD work on how the Paralympic movement was engaging online in conversations. And I was reading the posts, but I was also interviewing and speaking with people all around the world about how they were using social media and digital platforms to stay connected and to connect the Paralympic movement. It was also, ever since then, like, this is the first project where I felt my sport interests, my academic interests, and just my community were really coming together. And I love that feeling. So from then on, I was a parasport researcher. Now, before I dig into some of the recent research, I'm going to provide, this is like the very, very, very brief history of Paralympic sport. I think there are some really unique elements to the Paralympic movement. They're highly relevant to some of the discussions that I want to have today. And also like relevant to thinking about our role. And by that, I mean researchers, sport scientists, practitioners, sport organizers, participants, people with disabilities, like where we fit within the Paralympic movement. And to have that conversation, I think we do need to understand a bit of the history. So apologies to any historians in the crowd. But first, people with disabilities have always done sport. Like, it would be hugely inaccurate for me to say that like there is a moment when disability sports started. That's not true. But there is one moment when we can like sort of pinpoint the start of the Paralympic Games. And that's linked with, the birth of the Paralympic movement. And so I'm going to tell you a bit what Danielle Piers at the University of Alberta calls the origin story of the Paralympic Games. It happened in 1948 at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. This is a hospital in the UK that had a unit for people with spinal cord injuries. And in 1948, most of the patients in that hospital were injured war veterans. The head of the hospital was Dr. Ludwig Gutmann. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the name. A Jewish neurologist who fled Germany prior to the war and was practicing medicine in England. So according to the legend and maybe a few historical sources and newsletters, Dr. Gutmann came across a group of patients and orderlies who were playing like kind of a version of polo in their wheelchairs. And he observed that this group of patients who were highly unmotivated to participate in the exercises he prescribed them were very motivated to participate in sport. So that's how sport became part of the program at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. He wrote in the hospital's newsletter that sport could be a vehicle to promote the physical rehabilitation of individuals with spinal cord injury, but that also sport was a way of returning men to work, to living independently, basically back to being members of society. And that's how he was going to use sport. So they organized the Stoke Mandeville Games. The first games were held to coincide with the London Olympics happening not that far away. So the first photo there is of the early Stoke Mandeville Games, several participants in wheelchairs practicing archery. The event grew in size and scope over the years, and other hospitals were invited to participate. And in 1960, they left Stoke Mandeville and went to Rome, where they were hosted by a hospital in Rome. And that's generally considered sort of the first, what we know of the Paralympic Games. Rome was also hosting the Olympics. So it sort of set that model that the Stoke Mandeville Games, soon to be called the Paralympics, would follow the Olympics around and be hosted every 4 years. The Paralympic Games continued to grow through the 70s and 80s. It's often referred to as the era of participation. The joke is that sometimes there were more medals given out than athletes. There was a real focus on like growing the number of participants, growing the number of sports, adding different impairment groups to the program. And then in the mid-1980s, we sort of start to see a shift. This is where we see a new type of Paralympian emerge. This Paralympian is a serious competitor, a serious athlete, and they're training full-time. I mean, they might also be working full-time, but they're training full-time. And the photo here I have is of Rick Hansen, who's really like emblematic of this era in many ways. He's also a graduate of UBC School of Kinesiology. So I use a photo of him every chance I get. And this photo, he's actually training in one of our biomechanics labs. Like I said, I love listening to biomechanics talks, and I stumbled across this photo going through some of our archives. Since this moment, though, you see this like higher, faster, stronger trend in Paralympic sport, this notion that it's going to be an elite group of athletes who continue in Paralympic sport. And the two photos I have there from 1998, Nagano 2016, I mean, I just pulled these out of the CPC's archives because they just, to me, sort of exemplify the standard of sport performance that characterizes that next era of the Paralympic Games. So, although there's been many significant changes in the Paralympic movement, I'm a sociologist, and part of my job is also to think of like what stays the same. And when I look at this brief history of parasport, I pick out a couple of like tropes, narrative tropes or assumptions that have actually remained remarkably consistent throughout the, 7 decades. And the first is that sport is beneficial for people with disabilities. So that history of sport, the history of disability sport is very closely entwined with the rehabilitation of people with disabilities and a very medical model of disability that I'm sure is not a new concept for many of you. But there's this notion that disability is a tragedy, but that the damaged body can be repaired or pushed towards greater function, and sport can be part of that project. The second assumption that I see as very closely linked to the first is that disability sport is for people with disabilities, but not always by people with disabilities. And by that, I mean, in the early days, you see the Paralympic Games being organized by medical doctors, hosted by hospitals. That's not the case anymore. But the fact remains there are still very few people with disabilities working in disability sport. In roles such as coaching and management and leadership, they remain very underrepresented. So it's still sport for people with disabilities, but not by people with disabilities. And the other way you could think of this is that medical practitioners are still very much part of the Paralympic movement as classifiers, as recruiters in the rehabilitation hospitals. They're in our networks, they're part of the Paralympic movement, and that's remained remarkably consistent. And then the final assumption here is that disability sport is both progressing and progressive. And what I mean by that is that, I showed you on that last slide, these images that sort of show us going towards this elite sport and the notion that we're progressing towards an Olympic style of sport. Some people have called that the Olympification of Paralympic sport, that the Olympics are the standard that the Paralympics are trying to reproduce. So that's how progress is being measured. In the second sense is the notion that the Paralympic movement is progressive. And by that, I mean aligned with a political orientation towards social change, equity, justice. And it's frequently assumed that when you promote or advance disability sport, you're also advancing, for example, disability rights. And that's something I think we could talk about. But I'm just going to leave those assumptions with you. I want, maybe keep them in mind as I work through the couple research projects. I've got 2 screens here. I'm trying to remember which one to advance. Great. Okay. So the first project I want to share with you is a SSHRC-funded project that looks at integration in the BC sports sector. So the background for this is that, in the late 90s, Sport Canada started to promote integration, by which they meant that these disability sport organizations that had previously selected athletes for the Paralympic Games were now going to sort of fold into the mainstream or able-bodied sport system, like Swim Canada, Athletics Canada. Quite a bit has actually been studied about how integration has worked, so I'm not going to go into that. But what I will point out is that we're all probably we have some internationals on the call. I shouldn't assume it, but in Canada, most sport opportunities are not delivered by Sport Canada. They're delivered by the provinces and within regional associations. And that means that, even if you're talking about Paralympic athlete, most Paralympic athletes spend a lot of time in their provinces, in their regional clubs before they even hit before they ever hit the national team. So understanding what's happening at a provincial and regional level is very important. And that's also a really big gap in the research right now. BC is probably like similar and dissimilar to all provinces. And by that, I mean, all of our provinces have very unique structures, but generally speaking, they all have this group of provincial sport organizations. And then they have a few disability sport organizations. In BC, that's BC wheelchair sport and BC blind sport. I'm sure you have familiar configurations where you are. So our project is to look at BC, how has integration been done? And like, what have been the implications for opportunities for people with disabilities? I'm seeing a bit of feedback through the, oh, there's up, thanks. Okay, so what we did is we conducted interviews with sport managers, people working within these sport organizations. We also had several open houses with different disability sport groups, a couple of municipalities. We had panel discussions and just general conversations with people in this space. We also surveyed people with disabilities and did 12 interviews as well as with people who support people with disabilities. And we looked at various policy documents and websites throughout the BC sports sector. We were also very fortunate that we were partnering in this research with Via Sport, that is the pseudo government arm in BC that administers sport funding. So this is perhaps a bit unique to BC, but they're not a ministry per se, but they basically oversee all the government's investment in sport by grants. So Via Sport funds 54 sport organizations, as well as all these sport events. So what we had there was every 4 years, they do a review of their investment that requires all the sport organizations to send a lot of information back to them. And we were able to put a lot of our own questions and gather a lot of data by asking them what they were doing for disability sport, how that was working for them in the process of doing that review. What did we find? Despite this sort of like common narrative that like integration is the gold standard and we should all be trying for integration, what we found is that at the grassroots level, integration was resisted. Particularly interesting to me was that it was being resisted both by the provincial sport organizations and the disability sport organizations, although for different reasons and in different ways. The provincial sport organizations felt like disability was an add-on. You know, they had their operations and then at some point they were just told that they had to do more. You just have to add this new program, this new sort of competition stream. It wasn't that they didn't want to do that, but they felt like you're asking us to do more, but you're not resourcing us more. So one of the quotes here from managers, you know, one of the things we're seeing here in British Columbia is that we're not doing things really well yet for whom we have. We're looking to be able to include inclusive opportunities for those who want, but we're not right now looking to grow. So this tension of like their core, their existing stakeholders, wanting to serve them and not wanting to grow. Now, the disability sport organizations largely resisted integration because they didn't feel others could deliver the same quality of service or would take care of their community in the same way they could. So provincial sport organizations really felt responsibility to disability communities and weren't ready to hand over anything if they couldn't ensure it would be of the quality they expected. So this quote from one of their managers says, you know, provincial sport organizations and national sport organizations don't understand all the various factors that impact an athlete with a disability, getting them involved in sport. And unless you're in it, I don't think you quite fully understand it. So back again to that positive first experience, ensuring the athlete with a disability doesn't feel excluded, doesn't feel they're the only individual in the club. There's so much value that comes from that social connection and engaging with others with disabilities. So they resisted integration out of concerns and just wanting to make sure that their athletes were having the best first experiences and were connecting with others with disabilities. The next finding is that there any of you who are working in organizations and going, integration is hard? Yeah, it is. And there's a reason it's really, really hard. Integration policies have generally assumed that there's sort of two types of organizations. You have a provincial sport organization and then you have a disability sport organization. Like I said, let's take swimming BC and wheelchair sport BC or blind sport BC. And that you can develop some sort of integration policy that's one size fits all. Well, what we found is that most PSOs are kind of generally the same. They have the same pathways, the same structures. DSOs come in all shapes and sizes. So I'll share with you here. One of the exercises we did was we mapped the networks of every one of those, I think, 54 organizations. And this is the map of BC Blind Sport. I don't expect you to read all of it, but what I want you to look at is I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's to the right of the big pink box that says BC Blind Sport, there's goalball. Goalball is what they're funded to do. Goalball is the sport that they oversee in the Paralympic program, right? It doesn't have any other organization. BC Blind Sport like runs it. The ones in blue are all of the sports that have visually impaired athletes in them. And that BC Blind Sport is supporting those athletes in some way. However, they're not the one running the competitions. On the left side, you've got everything else they're doing for the blind and visually impaired community that isn't really considered part of our sport system, but is a very important like recreation or sport opportunity. So pickleball and dragon boating. And then to deliver that, they have to connect with various municipalities and active living groups and independent living groups. And then, by the way, they also connect with deaf sports occasionally and BC wheelchair sports. And that's what they're doing. That's what they're providing to our sports system. They're this big, big connector. And what they're being funded to do is deliver goalball. Everything else is more or less off the side of their desk. You can understand why they're occasionally frustrated. This one, just to show you how different they are, BC wheelchair basketball. So this one is kind of a combination of PSO, DSO. It's a sport, and it's also a sport for people with disabilities. And to do what they do, slightly less complex network than blind sport, but they still have to integrate with BC Basketball BC. They connect directly to national wheelchair basketball. And then they also connect to BC wheelchair sports. And then they connect to various other, like I said, municipalities that actually have the facilities they need to run their programs. So in some cases, they're providing equipment. In some cases, they're supporting specific athletes. In some cases, they're organizing events. Sometimes they're certifying coaches or officials. That's what they're doing. And then you've got Cross Country BC, my own sport, the simplest of the networks, and still not a simple network, I'd say that. But they are sort of the most integrated. They kind of most closely match that model of integration in that they connect with one PSO, or it's one PSO that has para-Nordic skiing as well as like able-bodied or mainstream skiing. They connect very directly to Cross Country Canada, and they have some connections with deaf sport and Special Olympics, but not that much. They're the simplest. They're also, by the way, the one that's considered the most successful in the investment review, in that they consistently get a lot of para athletes to the national team. They win a lot of medals. So I'm not actually doing this to minimize what they're doing. I'm very proud of what Cross Country BC has done, but I'm saying that one of the reasons they're successful is that they also have the fewest moving parts here, and they control more of their own environment. So in total, we came up with like a typology, 5 different types of DSOs and how they support parasport. So some of them, like I said, are running a sport program. Others are supporting athletes to go to another organization. And what does this mean? We're still working through a lot of this. I have meetings with VIA Sport next week to discuss how this is going to impact some of their funding decisions. But what we do know is that you can't have a one-size-fits-all integration policy. You cannot simply mandate that PSOs deliver parasport without taking into consideration what you're providing them to do that. And you also can't ignore the role that the DSOs are doing that is really this like, they are the connectors that take us out of the sport realm and connect with the disability communities and the different service providers. So we need to start recognizing them. And by recognizing them, I mean funding them to do that work and not just assuming they run goalball. The next project, I'm keeping an eye on time. Yeah. The next project was looking at women in the Paralympic movement. And the impetus for this is really the two women that I skied with, Margarita and Courtney, and this is a photo of us closing ceremonies, I think in Vancouver 2010. At those games, I think at one of the games, I was one of two women guiding VI athletes in any sport. At the other games, I think I might have been the only one, or once again, one of two. And anyway, I just started lining up at the start line and going, for a women's event, there's a lot of men on this start line. And then that got me looking around going, how many female athletes are here? How many women are coaching? How many women are in leadership positions? And that sent me just to do some digging of the data that was publicly available. And that's where this project came from. So also SSHRC funded with one of my collaborators, the other David Howe, was my collaborator on this project from Western University. Just a few stats to get us started. So, and we're currently updating this with Tokyo and Beijing, Tokyo and Beijing, but the stats I have are Rio and Pyeongchang. So in Rio, 38% of the athletes were female. And then when you look at like two sports, in football and wheelchair rugby combined, you have 272 athletes. Of those 272, only 2 were female. Then you look at 2 of the new sports that were first introduced in Rio, and you had 120 athletes who competed in canoeing and triathlon combined, of which 59 were female, so nearly half. And I just want to share that to show that like that 38% is actually kind of, it takes away from, or it makes it look a little more balanced than it actually is. You've actually got a couple sports that are like very, very balanced, and then you have a couple sports that are not balanced at all, where we see very few women, if any. Pyeongchang is kind of similar, although the Winter Games are a smaller event. So at Pyeongchang, you've got 23% of the 500 athletes are female. And then you've got para ice hockey. I'm sure some of you know this number, it was in the news recently, but like 1 female athlete over 135. Now, when we looked at nations, like the delegations from the nations, in the past 4 summer games, 174 delegations from 97 countries. So some of them did this repeatedly at multiple games. Sometimes it was a one-off, but did not send a single female athlete. And the worst part is that did not improve. Like you go, okay, well, if this is in the 90s and then in 2010, it's slightly better, in 2020, it's slightly better. No, it's sometimes worse. The same countries send no female athletes over and over and over. This doesn't happen in the Olympics. In the Olympics, when a country doesn't send a single female, they get publicly called out. And the next time they send at least 1 woman. Apparently, this isn't an issue in disability sport. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into, sorry, I think I skipped this slide. We did hear interviews with 29 people involved worldwide as athletes, coaches, and organizers who had personal experience or who were involved in policies or initiatives or strategies to promote gender equity or gender balance in the Paralympic movement. We spoke with people from 15 different countries and 10 different sports. And then we also looked at like selection documents, so team selection documents, policy documents, the IPC strategic and vision documents. And that's what I'm drawing on for what I'll show you next. So we looked more in depth at 4 sports, 2 summer and 2 winter. Now, interestingly, all of these sports are co-ed sports, according to the official IPC sites. Now, para-equestrian. This one's interesting because it has no gender quota. When you look at what size of a team Canada can send, it just refers to athletes or riders, no mention of gender at all. The team composition instead focuses on ensuring diverse representation of impairment types or impairment classes. It is the only sport in the Paralympics that consistently has more female athletes than male athletes. Wheelchair curling states that the team must include an athlete. The team of 5 must include at least 1 athlete of each gender. We can discuss reinforcing a problematic binary of gender there, but you need at least 1 man and at least 1 woman, and then the other 3 can be as you decide. However, we have yet to see a team send a majority of female athletes. So this is consistent with what we often see in able-bodied co-ed sports, where minimums, like you need a minimum of 1 woman, gets interpreted as a maximum. Some teams have 2 women, none of the teams have 3. Then you get para ice hockey, sled hockey, technically a co-ed sport. I've spoken with athletes on our national team who didn't know that, and they would be forgiven because they've never seen a woman on their team. The team size is actually 17, but you can add an 18th athlete if that 18th athlete is a female. So you don't even need to kick one of the men off. You can just add an 18th athlete, and yet very few teams take advantage of that opportunity. And I think one female athlete competed in Beijing. Then you have wheelchair rugby. Wheelchair rugby uses their classification system to create the incentive to actually make this a true co-ed sport. So some of you probably know the format, but essentially every athlete is given a point based on their classification. The higher your point, the less impaired or the more functional that athlete is considered. And you can have a total of 8 points on the court. So 5 players, 8 points on the court at any time. If you have a female athlete, you got to think of it one of 2 ways. You can either have 8.5 points on the court, or you can say like that female athlete's classification is dropped by 0.5. So an athlete that's a 2.5 actually only counts as a 2 on the court. As a result, 4 countries have sent female athletes. And what was exciting to me is when we looked at that next level of like, there's a tournament in Vancouver right before the pandemic. There was like the 4 Nations Cup. When we look at sort of that next gen level, we see actually a lot of female athletes playing in those ranks. So they're coming up. So the finding is that despite a stated commitment to advancing women in the Paralympic movement, there hasn't been a lot of progress, because you need to accompany these opportunities with, or you need to accompany these stated commitments with actual policies or programs that allow women to thrive in these spaces. So in wheelchair rugby, like I said, they've used the classification system. And here's a quote from one of the coaches, a male coach, says, you know, the big trend in our game right now is being able to find that 0.5 female that's going to be a legit player and not just a pylon on the court. As far as I'm concerned, the difference really is who can develop the best female athlete. So here you have a national team coach who's saying, I'm looking for and I'm trying to develop female athletes. That is a really great position to be in. And then we have a quote from one of the players on a national rugby team who said, even though at first I was the lady on the team, it didn't take much for me to get to be part of the team, and it actually wasn't that difficult. There were times when I was better than those who were in the same class as me, and I filled their position on the team. I didn't feel like I was the woman on the team. So she's having positive experiences because a policy has been put in place that actually allows her to be a contributing player. That is essentially where I want to end it. You know, 2 projects, very different, but it brings me back to this, like, let's maybe think about challenging some of those assumptions that sport is beneficial for people with disabilities, and start understanding that sport is beneficial for some people with disabilities some of the time, and only if we're really intentional in what it is that we're doing. So with that, I'm maybe just going to, I'm going to have a sip of water, maybe a pause, and then maybe we can open up the discussion and maybe what that might have sparked for you in your own practice or the own spaces that you're in.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Andrea. You certainly have presented a number of food for thought. And I was, as you were talking about different topics, I was looking at who was listening, and I was thinking, oh, that person's going to ask this question. Want to follow up on this. So I would encourage people, if you wish, to use either the chat function, or you can electronically raise your hand, and I'm happy to go to you if you do have a question. So I'm just going to pause for a second. I have a number of questions, but I don't want to hog the platform. So I want to give an opportunity for people. Oh, Padmina, great, from India. Heck, if you're going to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, for crying out loud, you might as well ask a question, and then we'll go to Padmini, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So how do I address you, Andrea? Should I just call you by your first name? Or
Andrea, please. Yeah.
Andrea, yeah. So my question goes between the question 2 and 3. Olympification of Paralympic sport and who is being left behind. And I think between both of them, my question goes to governance of the sport at the international level. As a disability sport researcher from India, I faced resistance in holding the IPC accountable to some of these situations. So my question to you is, have you been able to engage the IPC's leadership to become an interviewee in any of your research projects, or have you even tried to make that attempt? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. I think, you are speaking to something that's really dear to me as well, is understanding that like it has to be international. We need programs that don't just advance women in certain areas of Paralympic movement while understanding how many women with disabilities do not live in Canada and the global north. And to the question of, have we had success in engaging the IPC in these conversations? Yes and no. I will say, I can't tell you who we spoke with, but many of our interviewees were people in leadership positions, either in their national organizations or in international contexts. We have a paper a bit in progress that looks specifically at like the concept of leadership and gender balance in the Paralympic movement. But what we heard, I think, was everyone's very, very aware that there's this big disconnect. Like it's been 20 years since the IPC made a commitment to women in sport. And there have been initiatives, but they haven't been followed through always. And I'd say one of the things we learned is because they were often based on, they were often based on a one size fits all, I would say is one of the problems. So initiatives to advance women, and I'm speaking about women in Paralympic sport because that's the research project we did. I think you could apply this to saying like who else is being left behind. It could be athletes with high support needs. It could be, many different ways we might want to expand who's part of the Paralympic movement. But one size fits all was often like, we'll hold events for women in leadership positions, or we'll hold events for women in sled hockey, in ice hockey. But it doesn't consider that when we spoke with a few leaders who are coming from African nations, they're like, we can't capitalize on these opportunities because our biggest problem is simply finding we could find someone to send to that event. There needs to be, you need to link up these initiatives with like supporting the NPCs, the National Paralympic Organizations, to build their basic infrastructure, to do the work they need to do just to hold an event, a selection event, to hold a come try event, and then also build opportunities for women into those same things. Because an organization that's doing everything off of one person's desk and is really just trying to get any athlete to the games, they might very well understand that like gender balance is a priority, but like when you're trying to send one athlete to the games, you're very limited in how much you can do. So like understanding that promoting or advancing women in parasport has to coexist with all the other initiatives. It has to be embedded in all the other initiatives. So that was a big part of it. I'd say some of the more promising practices that we did see, or like more hopeful things, was there is a bit more use of like the regional network. So, we spoke with people in Canada, but also in South America and Central America, and they were connecting in very helpful ways. Like they were able to draw on each other's resources. So I think that was sort of like, you need these initiatives that sort of go transnational around like women in para ice hockey, but then you also work to build these local networks. But yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question, if we've managed to get the IPC's attention on this or not.
Yeah, you did, because there's no one straight answer to it. I understand that, but it's encouraging to hear that the IPC is engaging with researchers. It's not like it's a closed door. It's encouraging to hear that. Yeah, thank you.
I mean,
thank you for your question, Padmini. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
I was just gonna say on that note, I mean, I sometimes occupy that space of, I do engage, like IPC Vista Conference is a great network for me, but I kind of like I'm in a very fortunate position that I don't rely on the IPC for my research funding, right? And that has both advantages and disadvantages in the sense that I don't always have the access I want. But at the same time, I get to follow the projects that interest me. And I understand it's a very privileged position to be in.
Yeah, I just want to add one point before I pass it on to others. So you mentioned Vista, right? And I've seen these strands of research that has been encouraged in the past. And I'm still wondering, when sport governance is such a huge part of the existence of the Paralympic movement, how is sport governance not one of the strands at Vista? I don't go to Vista. I don't spend time and money to come to Vista because sport governance is my area of research and they don't have it. So if you know somebody in IPC for Vista next,
I'm very privy to David there, and I would love to see sport governance on the program.
Because you did mention NPCs, and I think when you bring NPCs into the picture, sport governance is a first thing. That's where a lot of the piece can be addressed. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this great talk. Thank you.
Padmini, that's a great point. I share your frustration and I share your concern. Andrea was a grad student, I think, when I first met her, and we had a very small group of kind of researchers in the sociocultural realm really pushing for Vista to incorporate more sociocultural period, let alone sport governance elements within the Vista conference.
And they have. I mean, this year's Vista conference, there was so much that excited me about it. But it's still all called sociocultural, as if that's like one thing. And yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I'm probably the only one who's doing that kind of research or work here in Asia. At least from India, I can claim that.
Yeah,
from
perhaps.
India.
Yeah.
So, and I'm a little disgruntled that IPC is not mentioning governance in any of its conversations, and I think that's a problem we need to address eventually.
I concur. Hey, I'm cognizant of time, and I want to make sure, Ozzy, we get to your question. And Andrea, just before I get to Ozzy's question, there's a number of people listening in that work in recreation and fitness. And so what I'm hoping is that at the end, after Ozzy's question, if there's a chance for you even to reflect a little bit on your questions and to try to put it into that context insofar as, because I mean, you're at ICORD in a hospital setting, in a segregated setting. And because I know there are, again, a number of people here that work within that industry. And so I think that might be of interest to them to talk about that. But Ozzy, I'll pass it over to you for now.
Thanks, David. Andrea, thanks for the presentation. I'm curious to get a reaction from you on what is happening right now in para snow sport, in that as of June of this year, the para snow sports of biathlon, Nordic, Alpine, and snowboard will no longer fall under the International Paralympic Committee in any form, including classification. They will fully fall under the International Ski Federation. And in addition to that, the National Paralympic Committees will no longer be the representative group for the sports in any of those forms. It will all be dealt with through the international or through the national sport federations.
Okay, now you have to show your cards though. You got to show your cards and say what you're doing, like what your role in this is too. You can't set her up.
Well, my role in this is over the last 2 years, I've been one of a small group that has affected this change coming forward. And for context, we looked at IPC was driving the idea of removing the sports from IPC towards standalone federations. And we investigated looking at existing federations versus creating a standalone international federation, and the timing and the situation of the leadership changes at the International Ski Federation were one of a desire of more inclusivity, and they saw the para opportunity making them look very good from an inclusivity end of things. So the stars aligned in many ways, and this is what is happening. By the end of June, this will all be formalized. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts as to, will that change relative to the 3 points of this talk about what are we promoting, et cetera, et cetera? Think it'll be a positive or a negative?
Yeah. I say I knew that was kind of a discussion was happening. I had no idea that is actually going forward. I think when you think about in the context of those questions I posed, it will be incredibly advantageous for some athletes. my own experiences on the Paranordic team. I mean, I'll say like I was a marginal player there, you know, but close enough to see some of the dynamics. And one of the things that really frustrated me, though, that I would be concerned about if when Paris Nordic skiing or when skiing goes into mainstream, the able-bodied system, is like, it will be the athletes with the high support needs that I'm most worried about.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it can't be done, but to not have an organization that understands that, like, for example, your guide should be decided by the athlete, that the guide is a very personal relationship and can't just be assigned by the sport organization, or can't be assigned by the host. Like, don't worry about, we don't want to pay for a guide, we'll just give you a guide when you get here. Or that is not looking at race courses and thinking, you know, there's some countries that our sit skiers won't race in because they're like, even with the adjustment, that point class or the like percent adjustment that's used in skiing, they're like, it doesn't really matter if we can't get up the first hill of the stadium, right? So like, if our team races in Finland, half our sit skiers don't go. So I guess I'm just worried about, I'm not worried about Brian McKeefer, who's retiring, but I'm not worried about some of our athletes. I'd be excited about some of the opportunities, but I'd be most paying attention to the athletes with high support needs and what happens to them with the move.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thanks. Your perspective is welcomed. And from a researcher point of view, I think we have just opened the door to a whole pile of research opportunities for all of you, because this is going to create all kinds of new scenarios and new considerations and new problems and new opportunities that we need to look at.
Mhm. Thank you for the question, Ozzy.
Thanks.
So Andrea, again, like, we've only got 2 minutes, so I'm not even sure I'm going to pose the question because I don't think it's going to give us appropriate time to respond to it. But I'm recognizing people like Jessica, people like Jeff, people like Vu that are involved in the fitness side of things for persons with disabilities. Could you not ask the same questions in that setting? And I'd just be curious to know what your thoughts are very quickly with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said, like, I'm in I-Court, I'm in a medical facility. We have a gym that is very exclusive in some ways. We only serve people with spinal cord injuries and a couple other related impairments. And, you know, I guess the question I'm always asking there is, I am always challenging. I'm in that difficult position of being someone who sort of challenges that health promotion aspect of, our students are here and they just come in, they're evangelical. They want to get everyone healthy. And I see part of my role is like, yeah, I love physical activity and exercise too, but understanding that not everyone's had the positive experience before, and understanding that, you know, we focus on, like, we build relationship first, and we focus on physical activity second, has been a really great way of thinking about it. And then also sort of like separating, saying, like, disability sport, Paralympic sport, and sport and exercise and recreation for people with disabilities are two different things, and that's okay, right? Like, not everyone walks into our facility. Stop looking at them only as their potential to make your next Paralympic team. Like, everyone deserves the opportunity to participate in sport and physical activity, and let's just start with that as the basis. But that's a very poor answer to a big question.
Yeah, listen, I probably shouldn't even pose this question at that point. Ogu, sorry. I didn't see your hand go up. Dr. Oki, are you joining us? I see it now. Where are you? Are you in Nigeria right now? I can't hear you though. Can you check your sound? Because I'm sorry I didn't get to you. I can't hear you. If you want, maybe if you want to type your question into the chat function, you can connect directly with it.
Are you hearing me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us from Nigeria this afternoon, this evening for you. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let me first of all thank Andrea Bundon for her presentation. Very wonderful presentation. But there are areas of concerns which I would like to seek for clarification. One, when you talk about equity beyond socio-cultural, because I've also looked at your bios, your first degree in biomechanics and sports sociology, master's for sociology. So beyond social, cultural factors that militate and inhibit, female participation, from the standpoint of what you are discussing. So which means it looks like what goes on in the Olympic Games also manifests in Paralympic Games. Beyond that, are there policies or programs instituted by, deliberate policies and programs instituted by some countries to sever women from having equal rights in participating in International Paralympic Games organization?
Andrea, before you respond to that, so Dr. Oki, thank you for the question. It's nice to see you. I'm also cognizant that we've just gone over time today, and so I don't want to keep people longer than they have committed to. So perhaps what I can suggest is I'm just going to give a few final comments to wrap up, and if people need to move on and need to leave, they're certainly welcome to do so. And then Letitia, are we able to keep the platform open just for a few more minutes to have Andrea respond, and then if people want to stay and listen, they may. Is that?
Absolutely.
So thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. To those of you that need to step away and to go off to other commitments, thank you for attending, and it's been great. It's great to see you. And then I'll present some final comments after you respond to this, Andrea. So over to you.
I'm just going to say, I want to, if I could just get some bit of clarification. So you're saying, are there any initiatives or policies that are specific to ensuring women's participation in the Paralympic movement? I have to apologize. I have poor hearing, so I want to make sure I got it right.
Okay. You want me to repeat?
If you could, just the last bit there.
Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that beyond socio-cultural factors that inhibit women participation in Paralympic Games, are there deliberate policies or programs instituted by countries to sever women from having equal rights and opportunity to participate in these games?
What I will say we found, which I don't think is a unique finding, although is not always considered from a gender equity perspective, is where you recruit or where you think your next Paralympian is coming from has a lot to do with gender balance at the games. So what I mean by that is that in some nations, the Paralympic system, for example, or the Paralympic system is very tied to, for example, the military system, right? Their Paralympic athletes are their injured military veterans. And if that's your starting point, right, you just know your Paralympic team is not going to be gender balanced if that is how you're setting up your entire pathway. So in countries that, like I said, the Paralympic system and the military system are like deeply integrated, that's something you need to look at from a gender balance or a gender equity issue. In other cases, something we heard a lot, and we've heard this, spinal cord injury, young men get spinal cord injuries, right? Women do get spinal cord injuries, but not at the same rate and often later in life. And so we heard a lot of that, like, well, you can't really change this because it has to do with the disability sort of population, right? And then that's also ignoring that there's a reason so many of the sports in the IPC or for individuals with spinal cord injury. We could add other sports or other events that are more aligned with individuals who have other conditions where you're more likely to find women. There's a helicopter flying overhead. Sorry. So thinking about that, like, I don't think it answers your question of like, what are the policies that say a woman has a right to participate in Paralympic sport, or how do we ensure that? But the often sort of unlooked at part is these like pseudo kind of policies and practices that just assume that like where we're going to find our next Paralympian, and that don't take the time to consider athletes, potential athletes, who are going to be more complex cases, like whose disability is not as easily defined. It's not an amputation, it's not a spinal cord injury, who are variously situated, intersection identities of class, of gender, of religion, of race, that like, it can't just be about, you can't just be looking for your next Paralympian and not taking those factors into account, or else you are going to end up with gender imbalances.
So I'm gonna have to stop it there. If for no other reason that the food that I put in the oven for dinner is cooking right now. If I don't get out of here, I'm in big trouble. So Andrea, thank you very much for spending time with us today with our research and community engagement seminar. This was outstanding. Thank you to everyone for your engagement in the conversation and your questions. It's nice to see so many familiar faces from all over the world. This was a real international conversation, so that was a lot of fun. So happy Thursday. I'm seeing a number of notes just popping up here, so we'll just keep it on for everyone, just if they have a quick thanks and just some connections. But happy Thursday, everybody. Get out there and enjoy the nice weather. And we'll look forward to engaging you again in our future engagement surveys.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. So good night in Nigeria.
Good night.
I know.
At the time it's 12 midnight now.
Oh, go to bed, man.
Yes, that's at 12 midnight. So bye everybody.
Bye, Oki.
Take care.